If the meeting could come to order. This is a regular meeting of the Princeton Planning Board. It's Thursday, December 7th, 2017. And the opening statement is as follows. Pursuant to Section 13 of the Open Public Meetings Act, adequate notice of the time and place of this meeting has been given by prominently posting the 2017 agenda resolution of the regularly scheduled meetings of the Princeton Planning Board. Such notice has been placed on the official bulletin board at the Princeton Municipal Complex and is to be maintained throughout the year by transmitting a copy of such schedule to the Princeton Packet, Town Topics, Times, Trentonian, and Comcast Media. A copy has been filed with the clerk of Princeton on the second day of December 2016. Legal notice of the adoption of said resolution appeared in the December 9, 2016 edition of the Princeton Packet. Could you call the roll, please?
Ms. Capizzoli?
Here.
Mr. Cohn? Ms. Crumiller?
Here.
Mr. Quinn?
Here.
Ms. Spruill? Mr. Texarney?
Here.
Mrs. Trotman?
Here.
Mrs. Ullman?
Here.
Mrs. Gunning?
Here.
Mr. Williamson? Ms. Wilson?
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. I had a couple of announcements on next Monday, that's December 11th, at 7 o'clock. Council has invited the planning board to join it for the exposition of the Princeton University campus plan. The plan has been distributed to all of you. You should have copies at your places here. And it should be an interesting evening. On Thursday, December 14th, next week, we're having another regularly scheduled planning board meeting, and that will be at 7:30. So Monday at 7, Thursday at 7:30. Does anybody else have any other announcements? Questions? All right. We have resolutions and findings of fact, and this is the resolution of the calendar for next year. I take it you have all studied this to see whether it conflicts with your favorite holidays. Anybody want to change something?
I'll move it.
I'll second.
Okay, it's been moved by Ms. Crummiller, seconded by Ms. Ullman. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Carried. Right, we have a large pack of findings which shows all the things that the board has accomplished this fall. Let's start with the first one. This is the Institute for Advanced Study. This was heard on September 28th. It was preliminary, final, major subdivision, and site plan with variances. And it's Goodall Lane off Maxwell Lane and Stonehouse Drive, Block 10401, Lot 3, Block 10501, Lots 2 and 2.09 to 2.16. Any questions, additions, corrections?
I have just a minor correction on page 2 in the fourth paragraph. There's a repeated sentence. I mean, it's not an actual. It says the same thing twice. That the house is two-car garage and 3 bedrooms.
Yeah.
You know, if here it is. It says as with. I just felt like the first. Oh, you know what? Maybe you need it. I don't want.
It carries the thing.
If
from
you
the
feel like you
previous-
don't need to change it, then it's fine. Forget it.
I think it carries the wording from what was
Okay.
previously approved.
Okay,
That's
fine.
with
I
you.
thought it said the exact same thing, but actually maybe it doesn't.
Okay, anybody else have anything? Would someone like to move this one?
Mildred Trotman,
Excuse
move
me.
approval.
Madam Chair, there should be in front of you a proposed amendment. I think we emailed it.
To the,
It was emailed, and it should be in front of you. There are minor changes to this one.
to this one?
That was the other one.
Staff had a number of discussions with some of the neighbors in the IAS.
I don't think it's this one. This is the townhouses in the battlefield.
No, the
did get
change
one.
was simply to add
I didn't get that.
the traffic conditions contained in paragraph 11 and 12, the planning board's finding in fact for the Simmons Dining Hall. And
Yeah, here it is.
it's in both of them. So there should have been, they were emailed out, and I guess we didn't put them in front?
No, it wasn't this, because it wasn't this.
It was.
It was.
We did
Yeah.
get it.
And that was left out. The neighbors picked up on it. I've spoken with Mr. Tarr. He's agreed as well.
Okay.
So we would like to suggest that become C, and then we would renumber all the other conditions. You want me to reread that into the record?
Well,
I'm not being, sounds like that,
I
no?
can't hear you, Lee.
Oh, we would like to add a condition, it would become a new C and then renumber everything, and it would simply read, "The traffic conditions contained in paragraph 11 and 12 of the Princeton Planning Board's August 4th, 2016 adopted findings of fact and conclusion of law regarding the Simmons
nothing to
Dining
do with
Hall
this.
shall be deemed to be conditions of this approval."
This is not the same application. This is not the same application. This is the Livingston Commons.
The same thing went in both applications.
It's to go in both.
C in the original one was
there was
the,
another
was the archaeological protocol, which would then become D. So we're adding, or requesting that you amend it to include in the memorialization paragraphs 11 and 12 of the dining hall application.
So this is a new C.
Yes, this would become a new C, and then we just renumbered, going ahead with D all the way through to the end.
Okay, did the rest of you get this mailed to you? I did not.
No, I didn't.
So, Mildred, were you about to approve it with this change?
With changes.
Hmm?
With changes.
Yes,
Yes. And then who was the second on that?
I'll second.
Okay, Ms. Trotman has seconded it. Ms. Ullman was the second on that. Also, anybody else? Any further comments? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Carried.
I abstain. I didn't hear this application.
The next one is 20 Palmer Square East. And please tell me if the rest of you were mailed something on these.
I was absent for this one.
Okay.
Absent too.
Okay, so
So where is it?
check and see who was there.
I think at the end.
Okay. Julie, David Cohen, myself, Ms. Trotman, Ms. Ullman, and Louise Wilson voted on the Palmer Square one. This is 20 Palmer Square East, and it's from September 28th. It's a major site plan with historic preservation plan, and it's block 20.02, lot 70. So, of the people I've named, are there any additional comments, corrections? Somebody want to make a motion?
Julie Capizoli, I'll move to approve.
Thank you, Julie. Is there a second?
Mildred Trotman, I'll second.
Okay. It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Carried.
And the record will reflect abstentions by those members who weren't present at that meeting.
The next one is, again, an Institute for Advanced Study. This is the Rubenstein Commons application. It was heard on September 14th. It's a major site plan with variances, Einstein Drive, Block 10501, Lot 103. Okay, Lee, are there changes to this?
Yes, and again, I apologize if they didn't receive you all. If you look at condition 20 in the report, or in the findings, there was a clarification requested, so that this would now read, "The Institute volunteered to make a $50,000 contribution for construction of additional sidewalks or traffic calming installations to the municipality for its use in addressing the Olden Lane safety issues." So it's really just clarifying the existing condition a little bit. And then in condition 21, we wanted to add similar language as we did to the housing one about the traffic conditions contained in paragraph 11 and 12, so that in the middle of the paragraph 21, you'll see it says the coordination with the municipality and the traffic safety officer should be continued, and then add the traffic conditions contained in paragraph 11 and 12 of the Princeton Planning Board's August 4th, 2016 adopted finding of fact and conclusion of law regarding the Simmons Dining Hall shall be deemed to be conditions of this approval. And then it continues on with another sentence. Those were the only other additions that we had. I don't know if the board has any.
Yes, Mr. Texani?
I don't know if we want to be a little bit more specific about number 22, about prominent signage. There was discussion about placing, bigger signs on both sides of the entrance to Maxwell. And actually, one thing that I noticed while driving the other day, it says private road, and I feel like that is a little confusing. And
I can't hear you.
so the entrance to Maxwell, and I'm wondering if we should be more specific. Is that something we can do now, or?
Any thoughts, anybody?
So my recommendation would be to have signage on both sides of the road, or
I think that's a really good idea, but the question is, did we say it at the meeting? I mean, I remember we talked about it, and I don't know if we can say something in here that we didn't specifically say at the meeting, but
I'm pretty sure that I mentioned that.
you did?
Yeah. So,
Well, then I think we should put it in here then.
yeah.
Was it on both sides at both Olden and Maxwell, or just Maxwell?
On Maxwell. Yeah. And yeah.
Okay.
What was the conclusion of the members present at that time? You said it was mentioned. I mean,
Well, maybe we can revisit the minutes or recording.
Well, I think we say more prominent, and I guess we can either have, well, maybe let's involve Mr. Tarr in this discussion. If we were to say more prominent, including signs on both the, I don't know, north and south side of Maxwell, or whatever, if those are the directions, east or west.
It doesn't seem to be on.
yeah.
Thank you. Speaking personally, I just think it's odd to have two signs. You could have a two-sided sign with writing on the north and the south sides of the sign, but I can't picture an institution having two similar signs on either side of a small road. So I'm responding sort of personally to the suggestion. A two-sided sign, a larger, more prominent two-sided sign, making clear that that's the entrance is the intent.
Okay. I mean, that's fine. I thought that was a little vague, the more prominent.
Yeah, but the idea was that it'd be a larger, more visible
Right.
indicator. And yeah.
All right. That's fine.
Do you want to read that language back, Lee? The larger,
Just adding the word larger?
And
Was it large?
two-sided.
I thought the applicant shall install more prominent signage, or more prominent two-sided signage at Maxwell and Olden Lane. Does that address it?
Yeah, I mean,
How about-
I'm not exactly sure what I said, what was said during that hearing, but I'm pretty sure that, that was mentioned. I don't think it's totally unusual to have on both sides of the road, because if you're coming from one way, you can't see it because it's facing the other way. And so, I mean, it's a little difficult to explain, but.
If you're familiar with that stretch of the road, there's a very wide green area the sign could be seen from both sides, coming up and down Princeton Pike.
Yeah.
Because right now, it's parallel to the road, and I think if we put it perpendicular,
Yeah.
then we would
Right.
see both sides of it.
That's my expectation would be perpendicular.
Okay, that's fine. All right, thanks.
So after the word prominent, we could be open paren, larger two-sided sign perpendicular to the road, close paren.
Perpendicular to
works.
Princeton Pike. That's the point, right? That
Yes,
it's visible
yes.
Except
northbound
that
and
that's
southbound.
not,
Perpendicular to
that's not
Princeton
Princeton
Pike.
Pike there,
Yeah.
that's
Right.
Mercer.
I'm sorry, excuse me.
Mercer.
You're
Yeah.
absolutely right, of course.
I've just noticed that, driving into Princeton, down Princeton Pike, you really can't see the sign.
No, you can't at all, right?
And so,
not Princeton
I
Pike.
think, what's that?
It's not Princeton Pike, it's Mercer.
Well, Mercer Road. Excuse me. Mercer Road.
Really, if we're going to put it in there,
You're
we should be
absolutely right.
It's going to say Mercer Street.
Mercer Street.
All these young people.
Okay. As long as we all understand.
We're on the same road here.
Anything else?
I'll move it.
Okay, thank you, Jenny. Is there a second?
Second, Tim Quinn.
It's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Carried. Okay, the next finding is Cap and Gown Club of Princeton. We heard this October 19th. It was a minor site plan with variances, 61 Prospect Avenue, Block 4902, Lot 7. Any additions, corrections? Anyone?
Well, I have another little typo. I know I sound picky. But just on page 3 at the bottom, it says, right now it reads, "The club did not wish to not expand into the front yard." And I think it means to take out the did not, well, just make it more clear. The club did not wish to expand and take out the not.
We always put one typo in to make sure that
I know, that's why I had to say it.
One or the other. Anyone else find a good one? No?
I'll move it.
Okay, it's been moved. Second? Is there a second for this one?
Second.
Thank you, Ms. Trotman. Any further discussion? Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Carried.
I abstain, Madam Chair, Louise Wilson. I was not here for this application.
Okay.
I was also not here, Julie Capizoli.
again, the record will reflect that members not present at that meeting have abstained.
All right, that finishes the resolutions and findings of fact, and at this point, I am going to recuse myself because the next discussion is the Tiger Transit Report. That's a Princeton University report, and my husband is an employee of the university. And I think rather than trot up here and recuse myself a second time, I will also be recusing myself from the hearing on Gardner and Esplenda because my joint work with Constance Greif was cited as part of the facts in the report. So, okay.
I think I have to recuse myself also because I have connections to the university. So,
Why?
If you live in Princeton.
Is he recusing himself in this one or the next one?
He's recusing himself for the Tiger Transit because his mother is an employee of the
Oh,
university. Okay?
So that, okay, just, I'm afraid we'll lose everybody for the next one. If you were all ready, I'm Gail Ullman, Vice Chair of the Planning Board, and before us is the annual review of the it's actually the performance report for the university's Tiger Transit. This happens to be a review of the year between 2015 to 16. And I guess Derek will give us a quick précis of what he's already given us in writing.
Yeah, I'm give you a quick overview. And it might be easier just to, if you have any questions. There's not a lot of change since last year. The ridership was down slightly, about 5% to 498,278 riders. And this is largely attributed to the closure of the Butler campus and the cancellation of the bus routes that went there, and also as a warmer winter. In terms of some of the changes, the university hired the consulting firm of Van Ness, Hanger and Bruston to examine routes, operations, and solicit consumer opinions. This led to the realignment of some routes and the rollout of a new communication package. The service changes resulted in a 11.3% reduction in overall miles traveled, leading to greater system efficiency. And this group also instituted a letter system for identifying the bus routes, like Merwick is now M, which made it, there was some confusion, and the opinion from the students was this was simplify the identification of the buses and the routes. They've also continued to keep their environmental monitoring of the CO2 reductions, which are in line with last year's numbers. They've tweaked the routes as needed to reflect changes in demand and services. The transportation demand module management system remains the same. They're looking at various options of carpools, van pools, mass transit, biking and Zagster, car sharing. And you got to remember, this is a year ago. I talked to Kim, and they do have some updated information on the bike sharing and the Zagsters, which is a large component of their plan. And then the parking demand, the vacancy is actually greater than it was last year. It was 10.6 this year, or 445 spaces, compared with the previous period last year, which was 253 spaces. So there's actually more vacant parking in their parking system, which is a good sign. And I think one of the biggest testaments to how successful the whole program is that staff has not received any complaints, and that's always a good thing. So, I mean, that's a real quick synopsis. If you have any questions, glad to answer them, and Kim is here as well.
Why don't I ask him if you have anything you want to add now, and then we can... I'm good. You look kind of like you're broken.
Can we bring the mic to her?
Yeah.
No, I'm good with the report as it is. Thank you very much. But I will take any questions.
All right, fine. Any questions, anyone? Jenny?
Well, my only question is about the I know that you have a new parking program, and is that completely apart from this, or the time period didn't cover the new parking program, or did it? Because you didn't talk about it in here.
So I don't know what new parking program.
I mean, the new, isn't there an effort to
reduce single occupancy vehicles?
Right. And
that's not part of this report. That would be the next report.
The next
correct.
years. Okay, that's what I was wondering. So you'll be able to compare how effective that is from this. And so
Correct.
it didn't start until this period was over.
So the biggest start actually was this year, But every year, we have tweaked the TDM programs and continued to have growth in those programs, which has led to the greater vacancies that we have on campus right now.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And anyone else? Yes.
I'm curious about, I didn't see anything in the report about accommodating people with physical disabilities and with walkers or wheelchairs, faculty, staff, students, or others who use Tiger Transit.
So the Tiger Transit buses are all ADA compliant. They all have a ramp. They all are kneeling buses. So it's very easy to get people on and off the bus in a wheelchair, with a walker, with crutches. And in terms of people getting to certain facilities on campus, we allow them to park in areas that technically aren't designated for parking. But if that's the only access we can get them, that's what we have to do.
I have a question, Derek. I know that according to the original documents that created this plan that would come to us every year, it was to come to the planning board. Does it go to anyone else in either the municipal staff, any of the committees that are working on parking? And
I mean, I know we share it with Deanna. We're happy to share it with council. You know, we could.
Typically, after the board reviews it and says, okay, we'll post it on the municipal webpage.
because it's really a ton of interesting information, and the way the town is bustling with parking and traffic and
That's a
plans.
good point.
It's, I should think it would be useful. So thank you very much. Thank you, Kim.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
So I believe we have to move to approve this. Anybody?
I'll move to approve this.
Danny Crimino
Second,
moves.
Tim Quinn.
Tim seconds. All in favor?
Aye.
It passes.
And, you know, I'll also share this with the Public Transit Committee.
Okay, the next application is an appeal by Timothy Gardner and Meredith Aspunk of a decision by the Princeton Historical Commission regarding the fence at 166 Cherry Hill Road, Block 5201, or as we also know it as Tusculum. I'll pause just a second to point out that under the revision of ordinances at the time of consolidation, it became a new rule that appeals from the Historical Preservation Commission would be reviewed by this group. So we've never done it before. And we will try to do it carefully, recognizing that we may be on a little bit unfamiliar ground. Did you want to?
Oh, because I was chair at Historic Preservation, I was told that I should recuse myself
All right.
on this.
Thank you, Julie. That's Mrs. Capizzoli. I'll also point out to the board that in the dossier that Lee Solo provided, he addressed the issues of appeals to the planning board, and I assume you all will have read it and be familiar with what it says. But if you have questions, now's a good time to ask about the process, because we have our lawyer here to answer them. Jenny.
I have a question about the fact that the applicant did not apply. How does that factor into this? I mean, because, for instance, could we turn this down because they failed to follow the proper procedure, or is it just about the actual decision?
Well, I guess, let me use that as a segue, just from what Ms. Ullman said of the report that Lee has and the appeals section. Yes, we hear appeals. Unlike other appeals where the question is, what did the body below do and did they incorrectly make a decision, this section says we hear it new. So we're hearing tonight the question of should this fence be approved, not whether the Historic Preservation Committee made a mistake or commission.
So how does
in terms of the question that you're raising, the fact that the applicant proceeded to install the fence without approval, I guess two things about it. Number one, they don't have any added rights by virtue of the fact that the fence exists, nor are we to penalize them for not getting the approval. There's a letter in the file that explains to the HPC why it proceeded, why they proceeded without obtaining the approval. It apologizes. It said they didn't understand they needed it, etc. So that's a neutral fact that neither gives the applicant added rights nor should they be penalized. They did subsequently appeal. It's now before us.
Well, can anybody, I mean, are they going to be penalized by, I mean, anyone, or?
Well, if the board determines that the fence that's there is not appropriate or doesn't meet the ordinance standards, then they'll have to remove it, and that'll be the penalty. Typically, there's no penalty for, even in the zoning context, when a zoning officer finds that something's hasn't been applied for, usually they're allowed to make the application that they would have made initially, but they have no rights vested in the fact that they proceeded.
That's correct. We usually just seek compliance or that they file the application and go through the process. And then, depending on what the decision is, things happen. But it's not something that we're looking to penalize somebody because they did something without a permit. It's more of following the process and getting the permit.
Are there any other questions about process? Well, I have one that probably only a chairperson would wonder about. And that's sort of the order of business. Will Lee present us with something? And then will we go to the lawyers of the applicants for something? And then what is the standing of the members of the HPC, if any are here? Are they considered to be the public? Are they considered to be part of the regular?
Well,
Now, it may not matter, but I like to know what.
Okay. Certainly, if Mr. Solo has more to supply in addition to his report, we can hear from him first. Otherwise, we'd hear from the applicant who's presenting the case as if it were anew, telling us why the fence that was built is appropriate, or the fence that would have been proposed, had it been proposed before it was built, is appropriate. And then in effect, the responders would be the HPC or the HPC members who want to be heard, or the officer, the Historic Preservation officer. So we'll turn to Lee in terms of whether he has anything he wants to add, and then to the applicant.
All right, that helped. Lee.
Thank you. I think Alan and Gail, you may have said pretty much a lot of what I was going to do, which was just outline what the ordinance is on the appeal. Just by way of quick background, the property is 23 acres. It contains the historic home known as Tusculum. It's located on the west side of Cherry Hill. And as has been already discussed, the applicant sought to replace a white painted wood board fence along the eastern property line with an unpainted post and rail fence. The HPC denied this application on April 17, 2017, and adopted a resolution.
Excuse me? Could you
Still can't hear me?
please- Just a little louder,
Okay.
please. I want to make sure I get it.
HPC adopted a resolution denying the approval. You have a copy of that resolution in your packet. It is Section 10B 380, paragraph 7, which permits this appeal, and as Alan said, you hear it as if it's a new application. In your packet is a bunch of information. You should have received the application to the Historic Preservation Commission, the HPC officer's memo, the HPC resolution, the National Register of Historic Places nomination form, a narrative in support of the appeal prepared by Mr. Casey, a report for the appeal prepared by Jeff Clark, and a report in support of the appeal prepared by Brian Ozenberg. I hope I said that right. So you have a whole bunch of information, which I assume Mr. Casey and his experts will talk about. I know some members of the HPC are here. They would like to be heard as well at some point during the hearing. It's a little unusual. This isn't really a site plan where we would review the zoning, as I think Alan said, or not, or in my discussions with Derek before he left. This is just, there's no permit for a fence under 6 feet in height, so it's a little unusual. It clearly is in a historic district and is governed by those rules and regulations. But in terms of, there's no variances. It's really about, is it appropriate in the historic context, I guess, as opposed to the general planning of the community. So with that, I think I'm going to stop, and unless, Alan, you wanted to add anything, turn it over to the applicant.
Just 2 items. You've listed, I think, 7 applications and reports. I think there are actually 2 others that should be identified. I guess, first of all, there is the letter from the applicant to Ms. Kim, the Historic Preservation Officer, and that's dated February 15th, 2017, explaining the repair versus replacement issues and why the applicant proceeded. In addition, there is a corrective document from Mr. Clark with some suggested changes to Ms. Kim's memo in terms of the detailed history of Tusculum. I don't think that implicates any of the issues tonight, other than that the record be corrected. And that was dated March 20th, 2017. I think also, by way of guidance, I would direct the board's attention to Ms. Kim's report to the commission dated March 15th, and in particular page 5 of 7, which sets forth the statutory I should say the ordinance standards, 10B 386, by which this preservation plan approval should be judged. And so that's really what we're doing here tonight, anew, since this is a de novo hearing on the issue, whether the applicant, the proposed fence, meets the standards of 10B 386 and is entitled to preservation plan approval.
I'm sorry, because I was like trying to find the document. Can you tell, it's this one? Okay. And right here, is this what you're referring to?
The whole page,
okay.
basically. I mean, I can outline it. It starts out preservation plan approvals shall be approved only if the proposed action, as may be modified by conditions imposed by the reviewing agency, meets the following criteria. And we're not here tonight to decide whether we like this type of fence or that type of fence, but whether this proposed fence meets these standards. The only other thing I would add, since we're going to reach it at some point, is if you look to the last item that Mr. Solo identified, which was the report from Brian Bosenberg. It's in your packet. Attached to that is a deed from the prior owners, Averill Moore and Thomas Moore, to the Township of Princeton and the Friends of Princeton Open Space, entitled Grant of Conservation and Viewshed Easement and Declaration of Restrictive Covenant, that contains a restriction about structures in the viewshed, and has relevant description of the type of fencing that can be installed in that viewshed. If you look at that document, it's hard to read the small print, but you'll see attached to the deed a plat of Tusculum, and you'll see Cherry Hill Road, and then you'll see a 6 or 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8-sided irregular shaped lot, which is the Tusculum property after the deed to the Friends of the Open Space, and I guess a piece may have gone out to the county as well, but at least that describes the property with the house on it, and the hatched piece in the front is what's viewed as, what's described in the deed as the view shed. So it's the front portion of the lot to the north of the driveway, I guess. So I think there probably will be some discussion of that. That's all I have to add.
And if there are no other questions, we'll move on to the applicant. Mr. Clark?
Yeah. This, Mr. Casey is representing the applicant, and our practice is to swear in even lawyers to the extent that they may lapse into testimony. Yes, so Mr. Casey, do you swear or affirm to testify truthfully to the extent you lapse into testimony?
I do.
Thank you.
Good evening, Madam Vice Chairwoman. Thank you for your time tonight. Members of the Planning Board, my name is Bob Casey. I feel a little uncomfortable sitting down, but I guess it's all right.
You're free to stand.
Yeah, I feel short in this chair, too. Like it's sunken. Did you? So we're here tonight. I represent Meredith Asplund, who's sitting to my left, and Tim Gardner, who are the owners of 166 Cherry Hill Road, better known as Tusculum. And they've owned the property since 2013. I represented them in their purchase of the property. As you know, they had a beautiful, admittedly beautiful white fence that ran across the front of their property that was there for many years. Dates back to, I think, the 90s, early 90s, maybe mid-90s. We'll get to that in more detail. Unfortunately, it became disrepaired by a car running into it, and it was replaced with a post and rail fence. You'll hear tonight from my client, Meredith Asplund. You'll also hear testimony from Jeffrey Clark and from Brian Bosenberg, who are both an architect and a landscape architect, respectfully. You'll hear about the facts surrounding the removal of the fence and how sorry my clients are for not going to HPC. They've had repairs and renovations done to the property before and have gone to get approvals for it before. So obviously, if we could do this again, they would have been there to get the proper approval to do this. You'll hear about my client's ownership. their care and stewardship of Tusculum. You'll hear about the costs associated with the fence, because that's a reality here as well, is that it costs money to take down the fence, to put up this new fence. It will cost even more money to take down this new fence, to replace it with another new fence. It's a practical consideration and one that speaks to sustainability, certainly. You'll hear from our experts about the appropriateness, and that's really the crux of this, right? Is this the appropriate fence for this beautiful property, this historic property? We feel confident and will provide testimony that in fact it is. You'll also hear about the view shed easement that Mr. Porter just spoke to. And from a legal perspective, and this is, I guess, one of the differences between an attorney and an architect, right, is that, to me, I love that, right? I love that document, because that document is a recorded agreement between the town and the Friends of Open Space of Princeton that presumably went through some sort of review for this historic property before it was signed by the town. And it restricted the use of my client's property, right? So there's good consideration. It was an arm's length transaction. We gave up something, and in return we said that, hey, we'll follow your rules. And the rules say specifically that there shall be no construction, installation, or use of any structure other than driveways and post and rail fencing and utilities as to the lands described on Schedule C. So currently, that would preclude, right, the construction of a white open board top rail fence, as Ms. Kim defines it. But more importantly is that this fence that is there now, that is a post and rail fence, historically is appropriate, right? We look at pre-revolutionary pictures. We look at revolutionary pictures. We look at articles from the 1880s that talk about Tusculum and driving up Tusculum and seeing a post and rail fence there. So I think that's argument 1A, right? I think argument 1 is the fact that we followed what we were supposed to do in the easement. And then 1A is that even if we didn't follow this, our fence is appropriate. So I appreciate your time. At the end of all of this, I'm going to ask that you kindly overturn the decision of the Historic Preservation Commission and allow my client's fence to stay. At this time, if there are any questions of me, you can ask me, certainly. If they're not, then I would just have my client, Meredith Asplund, sworn, please.
Yes, Ms. Asplund, do you swear or affirm to testify truthfully?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. Would you keep the microphone close to you?
Meredith, can you state your name and spell it for the record, please?
Meredith Asplund.
How do you spell that?
First and last name Asplundh.
And where do you live?
166 Cherry Hill Road.
And when did you purchase 166 Cherry Hill Road?
In the fall of 2013. November, I think around November.
Where did you live before that?
75 North Road.
In Princeton?
Yes.
Okay. And why did you buy Tusculum?
I have always grown up in a historic home in Pennsylvania, and our home at 3700 Buck Road in Huntington Valley, Pennsylvania, is also a very historic home, and I had some of the most memorable, best experiences there. And my mom is a collector of antiques, and my parents spent their entire life restoring the home, and the home around it was built by the Elkins family. And I wanted sort of the same for my kids, to sort of them to appreciate history and tradition, and not just a vast property, but my father was a hobby farmer, and he loved that. He spent a lot of time on his tractor in the afternoon, and that was his downtime, that was his meditation. So, and I grew up with a lot of weird animals. We had, back in the day in the 70s, you could have raccoons and foxes and raise ducks and reindeer and weird fun stuff like that. And I did want to relive that with my children. So and Tusculum was and is a property that, people drive by, as I did when we moved here from, we were living in London. We moved here in 2005. Yes, and always driving by it, you stop and think, how does this exist right outside of Princeton? And you know, I think we had been to a few events there in the past. And our first home at North Road was technically our first home together, where we brought our baby from London too, and had another child. So we were ready to sort of jump into the farm life, so to speak. One of the reasons why we love Tusculum was because it is a farm. It's you know, it's not grand by any means in that sense. It's not sort of look at me, look at this big house. It's a beautiful historic home, but it's humble. It's a humble place, and we never had the intention of turning it into something more than what it was, built a long time ago, and preserving what that was. And so when the chance came to purchase Tusculum, we felt like the stars aligned. Really, it was during an auction, and we could have easily lost it, and we almost did. And we saw a shooting star that night. I know that sounds really silly, but it sort of felt like it was meant to be. So my husband said, do you know what you know, I think it was, in some way, you have to be ready for something like this. The previous owners did an amazing job of preserving and restoring the barn. So there really wasn't a need to do much other than some decorating and maintenance, you know, making sure that the property is sustainable for a long, long period of time. You know, you can't just buy a place like this and not think that it can just be what it is. You have to continue to let it evolve and you know, put some spit and polish on it.
So you did that, right?
Yes.
You have, and
yes, and actually, Jeff was integral in all of it for us. We hired you because of your affiliation with Historic Homes, and he had worked on the property with the Moores, and we wanted to make sure that that was all in keeping, and so that we wanted to make sure we did everything right. We would have never wanted to do anything that wouldn't have been within keeping of the time, and we're not people that like to bend rules for any reason. All the approvals, we never asked to build mountains. It was very much, again, just sort of spit and polish, upkeep, updating. As you know, it was some of the renovations, I think, were in the 80s, and so we did, and we knew things that needed approval for the most part. Things on the outside of the home. You know, I without knowing specifics and details, I think you're allowed to do most anything on the interior, but on the exterior of the home, you need approval. Everything down to the paint of the home has to be approved by the Historic Society, and that was perfectly fine with us. We knew what we were getting ourselves into. And we were ready to comply with anything that they wanted us to do, because, again, we do believe in the historical nature of the home and why, especially Princeton. I mean, this is it's not just an old home in some town. It's in Princeton.
So what were the circumstances of the fence coming down?
So the fence actually was not in great condition. So apparently it was built in 1997, and it wasn't. I wouldn't say it was an eyesore by any means, but it was getting to the point where it was not. There were parts of it that were coming apart. So we had started the discussion of, you know, what should we do with the fence. It's a fence, so I hate to say it, but we just were not aware that that was historical, especially since it was built in 1997. I think we thought that as long as it's in keeping with the rustic nature of the farm, we would have never built a brick wall or a big, that wouldn't have been in nature, not to say that it was ours to make that decision, but we would just hope that people would assume that we would do the right thing according to the time and the date of the property and its ancestors. So it was about last fall, somebody drove their car into the telephone pole right up on Cherry Hill, and the telephone pole took out about 2 large pieces of the fence. And we filed a police report, and he walked away, which was really great because it was kind of a bad accident. The whole entire telephone pole came down. It split completely in half. And, you know, at that point, we didn't have a choice. The fence had to be replaced. If it was a new fence, and if it was in good condition, we probably would have just replaced that piece of it. But it wasn't, and you can't just replace one piece, and especially on a property like that, we felt that it would not be in keeping with the property of having just a nice looking piece replaced and then everything else was getting somewhat dilapidated. And that's sort of where it went. We would have never, as I said, done it because we didn't want to get the approval. It was an absolute oversight, and are extremely sympathetic with the Historic Society and their beliefs and why they do what they do. But we do want them to know that we would have never, this was not done on purpose. And the post and split rail is actually, this is a post and split rail as well, the old 97 fence. Everybody has a personal aesthetic. That's not what we're here for, to hear about what looks better. It's what's more in keeping with the property. We did spend a lot of money putting that fence up. Fencing is extremely expensive. It was thought out. It wasn't just let's do this. It was very well thought out, very well done, and it would actually be a shame to have somebody come in and remove that fence. And I did read in here about the fact that we tore the fence. The wording, it seemed hurtful. The wording was we tore the fence down and threw everything away. And I just want to make it clear that we didn't just tear the fence down and throw everything away. It was very well thought out, and we wouldn't have treated it that way if we had any idea that this was something, or just that wording itself sounds like we just don't care, and we do, and that's the point I want to get across. Sorry, I think that went on a little too long.
That was great. Thanks, Meredith. Does anyone have any questions for my client at this time? Next, I would call Jeffrey Clark to testify.
Mr. Clark, to the extent you're providing testimony, which you are, do you swear or affirm to testify truthfully?
I do.
Thank you. You want to
Jeffreyclarke.
Good evening, Jeffrey. Could you please tell us a little bit about your educational background?
I have a bachelor's degree in architecture from the University of Virginia, a master's degree in architecture from the University of Michigan, and approximately 37 years of professional practice, most of it in Princeton.
So are you a licensed architect?
I am,
Okay.
in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania.
And what would you say you specialize in as an architect?
Residential, historic preservation, some institutional work.
And have you testified before the planning board in Princeton before?
I have.
Were you qualified as an expert at that point?
I believe I was.
I would offer Mr. Clark as an expert.
Oh,
architect.
we accept his qualifications, Mr. Clark.
Thank you. Mr. Clark, you obviously, just tell me how you became familiar with Tusculum.
I was invited back in 1996. I've been involved with the property with two different owners since that time by Tom and Avril Moore to talk with them, and was very happy to be selected to work with them back then and to take all of our presentations at the time to a very nascent HPC at the time. It was a very interesting experience.
And what sort of projects did you work on the Moors with relative to Tusculum?
Pretty much we dealt with almost every structure there. So we did preservation and restoration of parts of the main residence. We did additions to the main residence. We did a renovation of the caretaker's cottage out there, and the barn itself was very simply renovated to be used and occasionally for some large groups. And then with Meredith and Tim, we did a small enclosure of part of the building that I had designed in 1996, and we did some interior renovations. And then the last project that I was involved with them in 2014 was the taking down of a long series of ramshackle storage sheds that nearly had fallen down, and construction of an appropriate barn and garage out there, which is a mirror across from the 1838 barn.
And now, with all of the projects you just listed, were those all approved by HPC?
Yes, with conditions.
And you had the chance to familiarize yourself with the fence. You've seen the fence. You've been to the property. You've seen the report of. You actually helped Tim and Meredith in their application.
I did.
Correct.
Correct.
And that application was denied. And you're familiar with the reasons it was denied, correct?
That's correct.
And what would you say in your expert testimony, in your expert opinion, about the post and rail mortise fence that's up there now? You prepared a great report. Maybe before you answer that question, let's just walk through your report a little bit, and you can explain to the board why it is your opinion, I hope at the end of this, that the fence is appropriate.
Well, I think one of the important things you have to look at here is the denial itself, which comes in the form of two statements from HPC. I'd like to read them and then address each one. The first one says, the type of post and rail open fence installed by the applicants, known as a mortise fence, is not the type of split rail fence that would have been installed when the historic structures were built on the property. The post and split rail fence which the applicant installed represents a rustic 20th century fence that is not appropriate for the property. Okay. First of all, it is the type of fence that would have been appropriate at the time, and we have shown in our report, and I will go through that in a minute, that it was a specific type of fencing that was used on the property at the time. And that report in a second will go into also a mix of fencing types on the property, which I think is important to recognize as well. HPC states here that this is a rustic 20th century fence, so obviously they're not interested in a 20th century fence. They go on in point 2 to say the white open board with top rail fence that previously ran along the property frontage, which I designed, by the way, although installed in approximately 1997, better relates to the colonial period of the structures of the property. The prior fence, before it was demolished and discarded by the applicants, represented a defining feature of the property. The new post and rail split fence that the applicants have installed is not appropriate to the character of the Tusculum historic site. Okay, so first of all, the preponderance of structures on the site are not colonial revival at all. They are colonial and federal period structures. Most of the extant colonial revival style structures there were designed in 1997, so they're not the important featured structures on the property. In fact, the 1977 National Register nomination doesn't mention the colonial revival period at all. It mentions the main house, the spring house, and the barn, which are colonial and federal structures. The only colonial revival house or period structure on the property was the caretaker's cottage, which is way to the back of the property. Also, that 1977 National Register nomination is demarked 25 feet back from Cherry Hill Road. So the original National Register nomination did not include the fence. That fence is within the 25-foot setback from the road. Now, if I could go into the piece that was written by Mrs. Greif and Mrs. Gunning. This is a description of a visit to Tusculum made in 1838 by Commodore Stockton's son. By the way, Commodore Stockton built the barn, something that we discovered over the years. It says, quote, "After entering through a gate, he proceeded up a lane bordered not by trees but by a stone fence on one side and a post and rail fence on the other, separating the lane from a field of grass and a potato patch." So this is just prima facie evidence that there was split rail specifically on the Tusculum property at the time. Now, we go to ask the question at the period, what did they mean by a post and rail fence? And we've got a nice answer here in Noah Webster from 1828. And Webster at the time defines rails, and he speaks about farms, and of course Tusculum is a farm. The common rails among farmers are, quote, "rough, being used as they are, split from the chestnut or other trees." And Webster goes on to make the distinction that fences that are close to a gentleman's residence or a primary building are done in a different way with pickets and things like that. And you see this in this original etching, which is the earliest known depiction of Tusculum. So again, you have a 19th century definition of the differences of different fence types depending on whether they're along a road, next to a residence, or agriculturally where they're being used to restrain livestock or for another purpose. Unlike our visions today, which might be to make everything the same, that's not the way it was done in the 18th and 19th centuries. We've got many examples here of period post and rail fencing around Princeton.
I don't know, Alan, if we could mark things, or if should we start with 1 or A, or however you want to do it?
Let's start with the one behind you.
Yeah. A for, instead of applicant, appellant.
Yeah, that's
appellant 1?
Appellant 1.
A1.
Do you want to describe that?
So this is a series of buildings around Princeton, no photographs, of course, but this is a pen and ink drawing of Prospect Farm.
Are these in the report that you submitted?
Yes, they're all in the report.
Yeah. Okay.
And this is where Prospect House stands today. And not only is there a post and rail fence, it's obviously a split rail fence, there are actually descriptions of the period of the gentleman that owned this building having to go out and replace the posts and rails after the British destroyed them when they occupied Princeton. Within 10 days, he had dispersed large amounts of money to replace these. By the way, that was almost exactly the same year that Witherspoon, who worked within a few hundred feet of this house, moved to Tusculum in semi-retirement. We also have the Battle of Princeton. So here, A2 as an example, where the battlefield paintings, which were done by people who were at the battlefield for the most part, also depicts mortised split rail fencing. You have a very early photograph of Princeton University. Some people say this one is the earliest known photograph. It's probably easier to see in your copy of the report. It's about 1860, but it depicts a split rail and post fence that's probably 30, 35 years old in this photograph, which would make it, again, very early 19th century. We've got a few other examples here that I won't go into in a lot of detail. The split rail fence around the Mercer Oak, for example. And then there's a very interesting sketch here from a book that's the study that's cited in my report called Partitioning the Landscape, which if you ever want to go read about fencing, all you'd ever want to know. It's very interesting because it talks about post and rail fencing, split rail fencing being used along roadways specifically, and it was absolutely ubiquitous in the 19th century, 18th and 19th century.
Is that on the top left of A2? Is that Tim and Meredith's fence?
That's the present fence there, top left. Although it has weathered a bit from that photograph and blends in a lot better at this point. And then I just want to address what HPC said about character defining. So this is an address to a fence that's only 20 years old and saying that it's character defining. For those of you who may not be familiar with that expression, it has to do with the rationale for preserving something. The fence that was there before was there probably from the 1930s. That fence was never discussed as character defining. In fact, in 1997, HPC permitted us to remove that fence. If it had been character defining at the time, I think a logical preservation approach would have been to say, repair and replace only the parts that are damaged and leave the rest. That was not required at the time. So you have a statement here that a fence only 20 years old is somehow character defining. Finally, I'd like to add some comments about the view shed. So the view shed was established in 2006. And basically what's interesting about the view shed is it requires a separation, a visual separation between Cherry Hill Road, the frontage along Cherry Hill Road, and the remainder of the property. That's a requirement. There have been some Norway spruces that have died along that area, and owners have been required to replace those. And I say that because, not only because the view shed has only 2 permitted activities, you can only put driveways and post and rail fences there, but there's a required visual separation. When we had a review with HPC, they wanted the fence along the road to relate to the structures that, according to the town, you're not supposed to be able to see. So there's a disparity there between the legal requirements of the view shed and what's being said as an aesthetic requirement that really shouldn't exist because you're not supposed to see that. And at the moment you can see there are actually a couple of spruces that aren't tall enough to make that visual barrier.
Did you want to mark
Yeah.
what's up there?
A3.
Yeah. That hatched area is the legal view shed.
You want to point to that for the board and show where the street is and where, what?
So
You want to better describe that for the board? It's not,
Well, that's a site plan of not only of the entire original property. I believe that includes the Green Acres land to the north and the Friends of Princeton open space land here, and then the Tusculum property there. Oh, sorry, Cherry Hill Road is right there.
The shaded area is the...
The shaded area is the view shed. So just in conclusion, we challenge the denial of a fence that actually reflects the architectural period of the most important structures on the site. It's historically suitable for a farm. It's definitely appropriate for use along roadways in accordance with historical practice. It's outside of the National Register tract. It's similar to other fences along Cherry Hill Road. There are other split rail fences along Cherry Hill Road in the immediate vicinity. It was used throughout Princeton over several centuries, and it really doesn't have a strong visual relationship with the remainder of the site, again, because of the requirements of that view shed.
Do you feel that it adversely affects the ambiance, character, or appearance of the Historic Preservation District that it's in?
I do not. It's consistent with other fences in the neighborhood, too.
I have no further questions for Mr. Clark. Go for it, whatever you're comfortable with.
Board members, any questions for Mr. Casey, Mr. Clark? Yes, Jenny.
I was really convinced by your all the materials that there were a lot of split rail fences at the time when this was built, and by looking at all of the photos, but the one thing that to me doesn't look historic is that there's so much space between the rails, and it looks like 3 rails that are all over right now. And I mean, it looks like the fences that people are putting up everywhere now. I mean, but I also want to say that I didn't think from what I read, I didn't see a lot of evidence that the other fence was historic either. So I'm just saying that at the outset. But I was just curious, did you consider putting, and it seems like most of the photos had more than 3 rails, like they had 5 rails.
They had
and
they had all different types of fences. In fact, we had comments about trying to keep the fence low, and in actuality, farms at this time were required to have fences of a certain height. And we're actually pretty close to that sort of legal fence height. But they used 3-rail, 4-rail, 5-rail fences of all different types for different purposes.
Are there any other questions at this point? Yes, Mr. Gordon.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. I enjoyed reading the materials. Always happy to learn more about Princeton history. You referenced the fence that was on the site prior to the erection, for lack of a better term, of the 1997 fence. What kind of fence was that?
It was roughly similar to the 1997 fence.
And that had been there since 1930?
We don't know exactly.
Okay. Thank you.
In that case, I'll see, does anyone from the Historical Preservation Committee?
I have one more witness.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought you were through.
Your Honor, Madam Vice Chairwoman.
This.
You swear the witness, Mr. Porter, please.
Bosenberg, I guess.
Sorry?
This is Mr. Bosenberg?
It is, yes.
Ryan
Brian
W.
Bosenberg.
Yeah.
Rosenberg with a B.
Do you, you're going to provide testimony tonight? Do you swear or affirm to testify truthfully?
I do.
Thank you.
Brian, could you spell your name for the record, please?
Yes, B as in Bravo, Osenberg.
And Brian, where do you work?
I am a president of Bosenberg & Company Landscape Architects in Far Hills, New Jersey.
Okay, and what is your your educational background?
I have a degree in landscape architecture from West Virginia University. I've practiced as a landscape architect in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Vermont, Massachusetts for the past 37 years. I am licensed in New Jersey plus 5 other states. I've offered professional testimony at over 200 planning boards. I believe I was in front of the Princeton Township Planning Board maybe 25 years ago, but that was many boards ago. I've also testified in Trenton at the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection Historic Sites Committee for the Borough of Bernardsville on a historic matter there, and have made a number of historic reports and projects throughout the area.
So thank you, Mr. Bosenberg. We accept your qualifications.
Thank you.
Thank you. Brian, you heard the testimony of Jeffrey Clark a moment ago and of Meredith Asplund. You also prepared a report that's dated August 3rd, 2017, that's been provided to the Planning Board in support of this appeal. I'd ask that you just take a look at your report, and not to be duplicative of what Mr. Clark testified to earlier, but share with us your opinion, if you would, supported by some historical facts, obviously, as to the replacement fence that we call now the fence at Tusculum, the post and rail fence.
Well, I think one of the things that struck me when I first looked at Tusculum, and I had not worked on this property before, it's similar to a lot of the other large farms and estates that we've worked on throughout New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, that the post and rail fence is a part of the landscape vocabulary of those types of properties. I mean, one of the things that I learned early on in architecture school that, fencing was very important in the 15th, 16th century, and our English settlers who first came here brought those fence styles with them, and they were duplicated again and again throughout our landscape and became part of our lives and common reference points that you would see when visiting different areas. So I was not surprised when I saw the fence that was there. I was a little surprised as to the fence that was removed in relationship to the fact that the era of the property, and I thought that what was there in 1997 that was removed was really not in keeping historically with the property. I think that a number of the examples here that Mr. Clark showed clearly illustrate that this type of fence was part of this landscape history.
Yeah, and, so you visited the site, correct?
Yes, I did twice.
Good. And so in terms of appropriateness, you know, the Historic Preservation Commission has determined that the white boarded fence, open board fence, is inappropriate. Would it be your opinion that the post and rail fence that's there now is actually a more appropriate fence for the era of the home?
Yes, it would be.
And as it relates to the National Registry?
Yes, I believe it does. I think one of the other interesting things, if you think about the history of fences, if we go back to, there was a 1781 supplement to an act by the New Jersey General Assembly which references fence made of post and rail, and it specifies a height of 4 feet and 2 inches. And if you measure the fence that was installed, and again, I had nothing to do with this installation, it measures between 4 feet and 4 feet 2 inches. One of the members of the board here asked about the appropriateness of a 3-rail or 4-rail and a 5-rail fence. And I have seen in my travels and in my professional work, we have used 3-rail, 4-rail, occasionally a 5-rail. And typically what we find is that 3-rail fences are more used to define the edges of roadways. If there's cattle involved or sheep or other types of animals, the spacing of the posts become more narrow. So I think that explains a little bit as to the reasoning behind the 3 versus the 4 versus the 5.
Thank you, Brian.
Any questions for Mr. Bussenberg? If not, now, can I ask the...
Yeah, absolutely.
All
No
right.
more witnesses.
Good. Elizabeth, do you want to say something? Yes? Okay. Come to the microphone and introduce yourself. And you're speaking as a member of the...
I'm Cecilia Tazalar. I'm the Vice Chair of the Historic Preservation Commission. And I just briefly wanted to make a couple of points. One is that, as you probably know, the Historic Preservation Commission is not allowed to take financial hardship or economics into consideration in their review. So although the fence had already been put up, and of course we realize just individually that that does present a hardship, we really could not take that into consideration in our review. So we treated the application as if nothing had been prepared. So the other point that I would like to make, well, two, about fencing in general, is that fence, that white rail fence, you keep referring to the 1997 fence that was replaced. Now, I was not involved I was on the Borough Historic Preservation Review Committee before the consolidation, so I wasn't directly involved in the review of that fence in 1997. But, you know, a white post and rail fence had been on that site since probably the 1930s, certainly since I moved to the community almost 50 years ago. It was there. It was really part of the kind of the identity of that site. And in fact, there are some areas of that fencing that still remain in front of the lands that are controlled by the township or the town now, and Friends of Princeton Open Space. So there are some remnants of that fence. One of the objections we've heard a lot of arguments about the appropriateness of post and rail fences, and you know, maybe we're splitting hairs here, but the type of post and rail, the mortise post and rail fence that was installed here is very much a modern suburban type of fence. Post and rail fences of earlier eras of the 18th century would have had different construction techniques. I don't think that it's very hard with these small sketches and watercolors to really get into the nitty-gritty of it, but for the most part, Most post and rail fences were either composed of like worm rail fences, or if they were, which would zigzag, or 2 posts with the rails sort of stuck in between, but not these sort of mass-produced mortised, you know, with the holes, fence posts with rails. That's really much more of a suburban type of fence that you do see all over Princeton, and you see in front of some, you know, I think there's a 1970s colonial house up the road that has that. But, you know, that's sort of splitting hairs. There probably were, you know, we didn't really do extensive research on the fencing, but just take that into consideration, that not every post and rail fence in an earlier era was exactly like the fence that was just recently erected, and that the fence that was taken down, you know, yes, that fence itself was put in 1997, but that was a replica and a continuation of a fence that had really become part of the identity of that property over many, many years, within the memories of I think, anyone who's lived in Princeton for any length of time. So, and I'd like to just give some time over to Elizabeth Kim, our Historic Preservation Officer. Thank you.
Good evening. As Ms. Tazalar said...
Ms. Kim, I'm going to ask if you would swear or affirm to testify truthfully.
I do. As Ms. Tazalar stated, the reason that the commission was really not supportive of the fence that was put up, because it really did have a 20th century appearance, which is common within properties within this area. Just to address some of the comments that came up and some of the questions, I know that there was the conversation about the view shed with the municipality and the definition of the post and rail. The post and rail definition is actually a very broad one, which would include the split rail fence in addition to the fence that previously existed there. And I was not in the position I am in now, and I was not involved in that deed, although I did reach out to the municipal attorney who was involved and asked if he recalled any details, and he did say that the intent really was not to remove what was already existing there and replace it with what you might call the split rail fence, but to maintain what was there and still have the openness. So it was really a broad definition. Regards to the style of fencing, when it's referred to as the colonial fencing, historic fences are not only about the time, but it's about the function. And the Tusculum property was known to have livestock and agricultural use. So to have a split rail fence as what was put up would not have either kept the livestock in or any of the wildlife out. So if a replacement of a fence was to be more historically appropriate, and what was mentioned here where there was a mix of wall and post and rail fence, then I think that that would have been a different situation that would have been considered by the commission. And as far as the report that Mr. Clark had presented, there were a lot of great photographs which showed those types of fence, but when I looked at the Historical Society, where I looked at hundreds of photographs of fences within Princeton and the adjoining properties, there were a lot of other different fences as well. So to be able to select the ones that are appropriate for this meeting, I don't think that gives a true example of perhaps what the fencing could have been. As far as the applicant stating that they were not aware that they needed to come before the HPC, I think that that probably is not altogether true, because I believe that there was conversation with the owner and Wendy Mager in regards to the fencing. After there was the incident of the accident, that they had asked about if there was any objection to them putting in more of a simplified fence, and the conversation was that it would probably be best to reach out to HPC, and that was confirmed.
This is something that wasn't said to you. It was said to someone else, and
It was.
How did you hear about it? I mean,
Well, it's an email that I got a copy of.
okay.
Well, I mean, respectfully, I know the rules of evidence here are probably relaxed a little bit, but I would be entitled to cross-examine Ms. Kim on everything that she said, and certainly the proof that my client knew about going to HBC before they, I mean, that's pretty powerful stuff.
I do have a copy of the email.
You are
with me.
entitled to
And I should
cross-examine
have
her, yes.
respectfully had it before this evening and had advance notice of any discovery that you were going to present this evening so that I would have the opportunity to rebut it.
Sir, can you
But
speak into the mic?
can we talk
Get
about
a
how
little closer
relevant
to the
that
mic,
would be?
please.
Because I thought that wasn't relevant to our decision. I just wanted, I want to know, it's important to understand that.
To understand what?
Whether the lack of applying, their breach or whatever you call it, if that has bearing on our decision.
I think that Ms. Kim is just raising it, and I don't want to put words in her mouth, just to the credibility of my clients as opposed to whether or not they should be permitted to even apply. I think that was at least what I took from it.
I'm not sure that that's what I meant, but I think I was just trying to set the information accurate.
Yeah, there is an evidentiary issue that Ms. Mager isn't here, and an email from her to you is really not admissible as testimony here. But I think what we've said is this isn't about punishment or this
Well, isn't it about the fence and whether
it's
we approve
about
it or
the
not?
fence.
It's not.
Well, I think the point that Mr. Casey is making is this issue of what his client knew. She's testified that she didn't know that she needed to go, and now there's other testimony in the form of a email to Ms. Kim from...
Not to me,
Okay.
but I was
Not even
forward.
And this
Right.
is, you've recently seen that?
It's actually was something that I had in the file that I had put away a while back because it was an application that didn't come before me yet. And as I was, cleaning, and I was like, oh.
Okay.
And I didn't even know about this prior to them coming to the HBC.
Okay, so I think for the purposes of this hearing, the issue of what the client knew or should be deemed irrelevant. You've heard the client here testify that they did not know that they needed to go, and maybe there's other testimony that is not presented tonight about that, but I think to clarify what we're doing here, the issue is really the fence.
We're deciding whether the fence is the right fence for that
That's
property.
right.
That's
We
right.
are. We're
Right.
not, we're
Regardless of how bad or good
We
anyone has
We
been.
generally
Exactly.
assume that the applicants and people in front of us are testifying truthfully, and I think that is the best way to proceed, regardless of whether other testimony comes from the outside.
Agreed.
So,
And just one more thing, as far as the style of the fence, I know that there's been a lot of conversation that this, might not have been appropriate, or maybe it was the only one in this area, but there is a photograph also of the Clark Cottage that sits on 545 Mercer Street, which actually had a very similar style fence, so it was not uncommon. I think that was dated probably in the early 1940s as well. So again, whether that was original or not is unknown. Whether the one on the Tusculum property was original or not was unknown. But I think that some of the comments that the commission was really trying to state was because it had been there since the 1930s, and whether it had been replaced in kind. And yes, it would have been appropriate perhaps to have certain parts of it repaired versus the whole thing replaced, but although it was replaced in kind, which often takes place in historic structures where windows are replaced in kind. They can't keep the wood, they can't keep the glass that's been broken, but they still keep the character. So I think that's also important to keep in the back of our minds.
I do have one question. It looked as if in the reports we had that when you advised the committee about this application, you either did not comment on post and rail fences or did not suggest that they were could possibly be appropriate. How did?
So my report as far as the split rail fence, not necessarily post and rail, because as I said, that's a pretty general term, so it covers a lot of different styles. The split rail fence, which is what we're referring to, which was put up, what I stated at the meeting, and I believe it was also in the report, I'm sorry, it's been a while, is that I really couldn't find a lot of information about that in the Northwest. There was use of that obviously in the West, where they use it more for farming, I mean not farm, but more like, I don't know what the correct term is, but more like, I think that they would put the split and rail and they might put barbed wire around it to kind of control some of the animal being corralled and things like that. But that was not a common one that I found as far as my research in this area of the state or the Northeast.
Thank you.
Having seen the reports of Mr. Clark, Mr. Bosenberg, and the photographs, does that now provide additional information to you that this type of fence may have been used in this area?
It really doesn't. I mean, I know that there was the information about there was a fence on Tusculum that was part stone and part post and rail, but again, unfortunately, there's really no photographs that were found. I mean, I had reached out to the State Office of Historic Preservation to see if they had found anything. I had done probably the same type of research that Jeff did after our meeting on that, and there are a lot of photographs of different types of fencing, again, in Princeton and adjoining areas, but there was none for that property. So it's always a guess. And I guess what the commission had determined...
I'm not asking about this property, but in general, in this general area, you're talking about, you said you didn't find anything for this geographical area.
You mean as far as the fencing goes? I mean, I think that Jeff had some examples of photographs in his report, but at the same time, as I had said, when I had researched the website for the Historical Society, where they have hundreds of photographs now on their site, there were so many different kinds. And those that were selected obviously worked for his report, but there were so many others that actually could have been used as well.
I'm sorry, yes.
Because I Googled also, and when we first saw this, and I couldn't find any fences that looked like the one that was there. I mean, I loved that fence. I agree with everyone who's saying that was beautiful, and I was attached to it like everyone else, and I thought that I was going to be convinced that it was historic, because to me, I agree that one looks 20th century to me. But I also did not see any evidence in the materials also that you created that the fence that was lost was historic. So
You're talking about the 1997 fence that
the 1997 fence. It seemed like that was based on the 1930 fence. I thought it was 1964,
Right.
but I must have. Anyway, but it was not. It wasn't. It didn't look like a fence from the 1700s or whenever. I'm not good with all the dates, but you didn't really prevent any evidence that fence. You just said, oh, that one was. Everyone liked it because it was from 1930.
I think that what the report was stating is that because it had been there so long and then it was actually identified with the property, that it kind of owned its place in time because of the longevity of it and because there was no other proof of anything else that could support a change that the commission felt, and I think that my report also leaned to the fact that it kind of has its rite of passage because it had been there for that long, whether it had been constructed in the 1930s and rebuilt in 1977, whatever, but that same style maintained in that location.
But I don't see, I mean, that, I agree with everything that you're saying, but it doesn't seem like that's the legal definition of historic. Like, you know, it's not when it was, the house was first constructed. The fence wasn't like that when it was first constructed.
We don't know what it was like. That's the problem. That's why we're kind of in this dilemma.
I know. That's what I'm struggling with.
Right. And what happened is historic structures always change. You know, there's an addition added, there's a modification. So you might have a structure that's built in the 1600s, then you have an addition built in the 1700s. So there's different phases of construction. So, I mean, what is the exact timing in which you want to place that historic significance? I think that's what you're looking for.
I always understood it was when it was originally built. But if that's not true, you know, that, because it seems like right now we're kind of deciding between, say, an arbitrary fence that seemed like it might have fit, and a 20th century, you know, it looks like a 20th century that also has a lot of argument for it, since it's made out of wood and it looks like there weren't white fences. At least, you know, like, it just seems like they're both, to me, equally not historic. That's what I'm struggling with. So,
yeah, and actually, Jenny gets to the point that we don't have a lot of experience with determining historical structures, so we're always thinking, okay, so this is historical as of the date it was built, the date it was reconstructed, the date it was augmented. What does the Historical Preservation Committee do? I mean, certainly you wouldn't have decided it was historical as of 1934 on a site that was essentially an 18th century site. So, I mean, I think that's part of the confusion I'm having in trying to figure out what the Historical Commission was making their decision on, because I have to say the applicant is the appellant, that sounds so like repellent, I can't quite get that. Sounds pretty persuasive.
I believe the historic
But
significance.
we listen to the Historical Commission all the time. They advise us, so we need to know.
I'll just make
their
one statement,
criteria.
and maybe I'll defer. Oh, here's David. But I believe that the property's date of significance is what it is classified as according to what it's determined within the designation when it gets designated with the state and/or National Historic Sites Council.
But it's not included in the register. It's outside. So.
Yeah, so thank you.
Okay.
Well, could I just ask one question?
Of Elizabeth?
Ms. Kim?
I'm sorry.
I mean, if I guess under the ordinance, the question is whether it's appropriate and compatible with the existing structure. And I'm not, we're sort of treating this as a binary decision, whether it's the old or the new. Could they both be appropriate?
I'm going to defer to Mr. Shore on that.
And maybe Mr. Clark could weigh in on that. Sir?
There's been a lot in this conversation this evening, and it's getting late.
My
name is David Shore. I'm a resident of Princeton at 498 Stockton Street. I live in a historic house in a historic district.
And you, to the extent you're providing testimony, do you swear or affirm to testify truthfully?
I can't understand what you're saying.
I said, to the extent you are providing testimony, do you swear or affirm to testify truthfully?
Of course.
Thank you.
With all due respect, I don't quite understand how, when we say we're going to rehear this case tonight, the expert on your board was recused. Can someone answer that?
Which expert are you referring to?
Julie Capozzoli, our chair, who I believe serves on this board in that role as the chair.
I believe she saw it as a conflict of interest.
Well,
I believe that could be challenged, but we'll go on that one.
Whatever she decided was what she decided.
she was told, she was not decided. She had planned to be here and told us all week that she would be here and discussing what was discussed in the commission meetings leading up to this point. So it was quite a shock to us when she was recused and actually left the room. So that's point number one, but we'll put that aside. Some of the other points. The law that we follow, our ordinance, is based on the 1966 Historic Preservation Act, which has the Secretary of the Interior's standards for historic preservation. I'm sure you guys have not read that. One of the basic points in there is that anything 50 years and older is considered historic. We have a fence that was not only there or its previous design, as we keep saying, 1930s, meets that criteria right there. It also goes on to say elements or structures that were character defining. Everyone has already said that tonight. People come up and say, that's been on that road for all these years. Other properties nearby either echoed or reflected that. Even the newer development from the 1980s across the road from this property put up a white board fence that they felt was in keeping with the look of that area. There was a reference in the expert witness's testimony that said he had worked or had references to Colonial Williamsburg. Colonial Williamsburg has a variety of fences, including sawn, board, fences, painted white, very similar or exactly the same as what has been there along that property. We can't pick and choose which testimony we want and don't want for this case. There's a lot of evidence and a lot of thought that went into this. What we're also forgetting is that we have just named yet another historic district in this town, probably with some of the poorest property owners. I mean, you all are aware of that. That was a very big deal last year. We're going to say to this property owner, oh, you didn't know that you had to come forward for this, when the very basic premise of the Historic Preservation Commission ordinance in this town is what can be seen from the street, in front of the house, in front of the property. There's nothing that can be seen better on that property than this white fence. But we're going to go and work on door changes and minor things that people want to do in the Witherspoon neighborhood and get those people to, one, apply appropriately in the right sequence, and then review what their projects are going to be. And we're going to let this one just kind of slide by. We did it in reverse order. We're sorry. That doesn't hold up. That makes all of us look foolish, our commission and you guys as well. That's something you got to really think about. I hadn't planned on coming up here tonight, so I don't have anything more to say, except for I really don't understand why, and I can read it to you, this email to Dear Tim from Wendy Mager saying, you got to go talk to the Historic Preservation Commission. I've got that email if you want to see it. It was distributed to us. It obviously went to the people who are here arguing tonight. It's addressed to them. They had it. The lawyer didn't know it. That's not our fault.
Well, again, we've already talked about this, Alan, and again, it's poisoning the well with hearsay and something that I have never.
It's not hearsay. It's right here.
Well, who wrote it? I want to talk to him. I want to ask him questions about when he wrote it. No, who wrote it? You?
Wendy Mager.
Is she here?
She's not here.
Okay, so like this is what.
I think we've been over this. We understand your point. We understand your point.
But it's precisely why we exchange discovery and why there's a process. There's at least some process so that I show you what I'm going to rely upon when I present, and everyone else should show me what they're going to rely upon.
We weren't asked for that.
Well, that's not respectfully my problem tonight, sir. I mean.
Well, I think we're getting a little bit afield. The issue here.
We're getting afield? I don't understand that. When it's pertinent and references this exact fence, it comes from the woman who oversees Princeton Open Space, and the question was sent to them about replacing the fence. How is that not relevant?
Well, the issue that this board has to decide is should the fence that they are proposing and which has been built, should that be found to be in violation of the Princeton ordinance?
Right.
That's the question.
Right. And they were given advice on that.
They were given, you are suggesting they were told they should have come to your board first, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this board is being asked not to give any weight to the fact that the fence now exists, but instead to determine whether the fence that is proposed should be allowed.
All laws in town, oh, I didn't ask for it, then we don't have to answer for it?
They have no protective right because they built the fence without approval.
I think you're undermining all of the municipal laws.
This board can tell them that to take the fence down. They don't have any protection by virtue of having proceeded without getting the approval first.
Right,
They are
that's one of
here
the-
as if the old fence was still there and they were applying for a replacement fence in the nature of what's there. That's how this application should be viewed by the board.
I think we understand what we're supposed to do. So let's hear from some of the other members of the commission or anyone else who would like to speak at this point. No one?
Okay, proceed.
All right, I see no one else who wishes to speak, so let's proceed. Do you want to respond?
I just want to
Mr.
make...
Casey?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Close the public.
That was not a public hearing. That was simply a, I don't know what it was.
Well, we were hearing from the...
And if there are any members of the public who would like to speak, who weren't, then we'll open a public hearing. But I believe that we simply have the two entities and a few watchers. So, if
I may,
you
just-
would like
just
to
in
respond.
conclusion.
Yes.
Well, Mr. Shore, there seems to be activity back there. Is there anybody in your group who wants to testify? Or Ms. Kim, just before we foreclose that? Apparently not. Thank you.
If I may, quickly, and in terms of the enforcement, right, that Ms. Crummiller was speaking to and Mr. Shore was speaking to. So that's why we have an enforcement provision, right? People break the law unknowingly and there are repercussions for it. The repercussions here are enforcement of the ordinance, right, which may mean that our fence comes down. So to simply
Let's just
change the
knowingly or unknowingly, correct?
Correct.
Right. I mean, you said they break,
What's that?
they proceed knowingly or
No,
unknowingly, but even if they proceed unknowingly, right, this is the process.
That's
This
exactly
is the
right.
process.
It's due process. It is in its most basic form, right? You do something wrong, you have a chance to defend yourself, and that's what we're doing here tonight, right? So to say that that somehow is analogous to every other historic home and people changing doorknobs is, frankly, it doesn't make much sense to me. People talk about 1930 fence. The only evidence that was presented by Ms. Kim was a photo. There's no photo earlier than 1964 that talks about white, and as Ms. Kim has defined this fence, a white open board top rail fence, okay? Not a split rail fence. Finally, the easement, right? The easement.
Wait, repeat that, what you just said?
Right. So Ms. Kim defines the fence as a white open board top rail fence.
Well, because I thought I remembered reading the year 1964 in your...
Correct.
So what is the evidence to when we first saw this white fence?
According to Ms. Kim's report, there's not a picture before 1964, but there is a story written about a post and rail fence in 1838. 1883, 1838, sorry. So
Wait,
listen,
is the
there-
post and rail the white one?
No, it could be a white one. It could be a white one. But the point is this, right? Is that when in 2005, when the Moores agreed with Princeton, the 1997 fence was up, right? So the town and everyone who took a look at this could have said in this document, right, a recorded easement agreement that restricts our use of the property, they could have said, this is what has to go there. But you know what? They didn't. They said a post and rail fence, right? So what we have done is we've installed a post and rail fence. And I get it, right? People are upset because the beautiful white fence is down, but we can't lose sight of what the law tells us to do, right? And if they wanted to do it then in 2005 when someone reviewed it, they could have done it, and they could have made it as specific. In fact, they could have beaten up on the Moores even more because they were willing to play ball, and they agreed to this. So to then punish us, and frankly, you're stopped from enforcing it because all we're doing is following what we were told to do.
Well, just in clarification, I think Ms. Kim testified that what was there could be described as a post and rail fence.
Tonight she did, but not in her report.
Tonight she did.
That's correct.
Right.
Her report.
So that there's logic to that as well.
There is.
To say that the Moores signed an agreement which required them to take down the fence that then existed might be a stretch in terms of what their intent was. So I think from the board's point of view, they're probably the issue of the view shed and the post and rail fence is maybe not the argument here tonight, because there's no testimony that the Moores that the applicant put in this fence because of the view shed language.
But there doesn't have to be either.
Right.
I mean,
but
that's right,
that wasn't
Mr. Porter.
that wasn't the direction in which it was tendered. So I think, just again, do you want to argue? Do you want to summarize as to why the proposed now built fence should be allowed as it relates to the ordinance standards? And for the board's purpose, the ordinance standards are in Ms. Kim's report. They're on page 5 of 7. Right. The reviewing municipal agency should not approve and grant preservation plan approval unless the following criteria are met: that the proposed action be appropriate to and compatible with the existing structures. Now, here we have to modify the language because this is not a historic preservation district, it's a historic site. But to read it as the historic site, and that the proposal must not adversely affect the ambience, character, and appearance of the historic preservation district. Read that as the historic site. And the rest of it I don't think we can do away with because we're not talking about the relationship among structures and between structures and the private way in the district. We're talking about the structure, the historic site and the public ways, and not adversely affect the exterior architectural features and setting of the structure and its historical and architectural character. So we have a sort of a language that is more geared to a historic district than to a historic site. But again, I think the question for the board is whether this fence that we'll say is proposed and meets the historic standards. And again, the historic ordinance standards. Just if you could direct your attention to that question, as the board will.
One of us to answer that? Yeah, I mean, I would say that, and not to duplicate the testimony that was already presented, and specific questions asked with the ordinance in mind, I think this evening you have heard expert testimony as to the appropriateness of a post and rail fence, identical to the one that's there now, right? That is era appropriate, is outside of the historic registration designation, is within a view shed for which we're told it should be a post and rail fence. There's been evidence that shows post and mortise, and that's an important distinction, right? Because I would ask the Historic Preservation Commission, what if we put a worm fence down, right? What if there was a worm fence there and not a mortise post and rail fence? Would they have accepted that? I don't think so. So, and I think that gets to the heart of the issue here, is that because it's not a beautiful white panel fence that is pretty to look at when you drive up Cherry Hill Road, anything that had gone up there was going to be insufficient. So, and that is not what the ordinance says, right? It doesn't say that it has to duplicate what was there before. It has to be appropriate. And certainly there's mortised fences that must have existed because someone did a rendering of them in the 1880s. So to say that there is a modern 20th century look to it is contrary to the evidence that was presented this evening. Were there all mortise post and rail fences in Princeton at the time? Absolutely not. There were plenty of varieties, I assume. There were worm fences. We heard that. We're not saying that everything was a mortise post and rail fence. But for crying out loud, it makes a lot of sense that this is era appropriate. And then you buttress that with having Richard Stockton in his visit to Tusculum talk about a post and rail fence. So there aren't any pictures, but there's a really good story, right, that was there, and there's other evidence that was in the same town, very close, within, a couple miles, that had a mortise post and rail fence there. So, I think our best argument is the 2005 easement, right, and the opportunity for Princeton and open space to get it right at that point, right? We did what we were told in terms of the easement. We were late, and we apologize for that, right? And we understand we're not rule breakers and law breakers here, because we would have done it with the barn that we redid. We wouldn't have Jeffrey Clark be our on-site architect telling us what to do, right? He wouldn't know as much about Tusculum. So it gets the sense here, which is frustrating, really frustrating, that you snubbed your nose at us and you did it anyway, which is contrary to all the evidence, okay? And to hear an email about something, I don't even know if Tim Gardner got that email, right? I don't even know if he got it. We don't have any proof that he got it. It may have been sent. I don't know if the email address is right. That's the whole point of having credible evidence before you, because I want to ask questions about it. So that poisons your thinking. I know it does. And it's tough for me to take the paste and put it back in the tube because it's already out there. So we've done what we have done. We haven't put up a stockade vinyl white fence. I wouldn't show up here if that were the case, right? Because we're stewards of the land, right? And this is an appropriate fence as supported by the expert testimony you heard tonight. So we would ask that you kindly approve this fence this evening. And I do appreciate your time very much.
Thank you. Board members, you want to?
Ms. Kim, do you want to? Ms. Kim has her hand up.
Well, I think
We've really closed this portion of the hearing, okay?
I believe we'll go on. Mr. Quinn.
Yes, I have a question about 10B-386 for Alan or for the appellant's attorney. Under the fourth bullet point, be consistent with additional criteria. B states, seeks to restore the structure or part covered by the application to the known or reasonably conceived appearance it had when first constructed or when it was remodeled. Doesn't that suggest that that the commission could reject the fence in favor of the 1930, 1997 fence?
I guess you have to tell me about the "or" in that sentence. So, I mean, I think, I guess,
So
I can't testify, but I mean, I think the board should consider the fact that more than one type of fence could be appropriate.
And it speaks to criteria, right? So it's not dispositive. It's not a shall, right? It is, you look at all of these things, and certainly it's something to take into consideration.
Any other comments?
Well, just I don't know if my question to Tim was clear. I mean, this says either when it was first constructed or when it was remodeled. So it could be a fence that meets either of those criteria.
But Tim, are you asking that because, I mean, maybe you're thinking the same thing I am. Like, I think the argument that Mr. Shore was making was that in 1930, that it's historic because the fence was based on, it was designed more than 50 years ago, and therefore, when it was remodeled, whenever that was,
The point that I was trying to make is we don't know what was up there when it was first constructed. So we don't know when a fence first went up there, what that fence looked like, but we do know when it was remodeled, what that fence looked like. That's the sort of
Right.
essence of my question.
but then it's also,
So
doesn't it have
I'm
to be
not
50
arguing that the fence that's up there right now is not appropriate for the site. I'm just saying that I think Alan answered my question in saying that there are several different types that could be, but that it appears that point B, by saying when it was remodeled, when it was first constructed, we don't know. We do know when it was remodeled.
But does it matter that it was more than 50 years ago? I mean, and we don't know that, because if it was remodeled recently, that wouldn't apply, right?
Yeah, correct.
I think you guys are off on a different tack. What our job is to decide whether the existing fence is appropriate for the property. We have testimony that at the time the buildings were built, these fences were, if not common, at least available in the community, and this is one of those. So, I mean, there are hundreds of fences you could choose between, and about, 35 decades we could choose among. But I think the question before us is, given what we've seen here, has the appellant presented clear testimony that this fence, however they decided to do it, is entirely appropriate to the building? And I mean, I guess I have to say, the first time I looked at it, I thought, I could not believe that a prudent Scotsman would put up a fence that he had to paint every 3 years. It just doesn't make sense to me at all. And I lived, I spent 6 years in Williamsburg. I saw plenty of fences like this in the country, not in the middle of town, but in the country. So that's where I think we should be looking.
Yeah, let me just add, this is not about whether the HPC was wrong. We're not here to affirm or reverse the HPC. The ordinance makes it clear this is a de novo hearing based on the evidence that we're hearing tonight, much of which was not before the HPC. So it isn't whether if you were on the HPC hearing what you heard, you would have made the same decision. It's whether sitting here tonight, hearing what you're hearing, you can determine that the fence is inappropriate or appropriate and compatible with the area. That's your task. It's not to say HPC did anything wrong. It's to say the applicant has a shot at an appeal, which is de novo, which is, this board is sitting to evaluate the testimony that's presented here.
So just to clarify, when we say appropriate, do we mean appropriate for this era, or do we mean appropriate for this property?
I think that's part of what we have to decide. I mean, I don't think that's, you know, there's a certain amount of discretion in interpreting the ordinance.
Right. I mean, you know, I feel like it's a fuzzy thing, and this is something that we should maybe discuss and debate. But I did notice on the website, the municipal website, there is a photo of the property with the white board fence. I don't know when the photo is from. It's of the barn. And so I don't know what that means.
Before it was replaced, obviously.
It looks like an old photo, or it could have been a drawing.
Well, yeah, I'm just going to try to sum up my feelings about this. And I've never done so much reading on the same application, you know, because I'm trying to be fair. But because of the lack of material that I have been given to more clearly dictate the type of fence that should be there in this historic district, and including what I witnessed tonight, or all of the comments made tonight, I just don't feel I am ready to say that it is inappropriate. I just don't feel I am, because there is nothing that I can put my hands on that says, well, this is why it is inappropriate. We don't know. There were not even any pictures prior to 1964, and the last fence was 1997, I believe, or something like that. So I don't feel I can justify saying it's inappropriate.
I guess the issue is, can you determine that it is appropriate?
More than I can.
Okay, because that's the test, right?
Just quickly, I know that it's not something that we base our decision on, but it does feel uncomfortable to, in effect, overturn a decision made by the Historic Preservation Commission. That said, both of these fences, if they can both be called a post and rail fence, can both be determined to be appropriate. And I'm struck by this photograph from 1898 from a nearby farm showing a fence that's indistinguishable to my eye from what was built. And so I couldn't in good conscience vote to ask the appellant to replace the fence they put up. I'd love to see a 4-rail fence or even a 5-rail fence, because of the livestock thing, right, that Jenny raised earlier, but that's where I'm coming down.
Could I just ask you a question about your statement? Because you phrased it in terms of requiring the applicant to take it down.
Yeah, so that
I mean, this is
I'm
not
saying
the...
affirmatively that I am comfortable that it is in keeping...
That if there were no fence there today, and they were proposing this fence, that's the question for the board. Because a couple things in that regard, I guess, to the extent that the statement was made that hardship cannot be taken into account or isn't taken into account at HPC, we affirm that. This is the same standard we're applying, and to the extent Mr. Casey talked about the cost that
And you're
what
right to
was
bring that up.
expended.
Thank you, because cost should have absolutely no bearing
Right.
on this.
This is a situation in which either the old fence is there and is intended to be replaced by the new, or there's no fence at all, in which case the proposed fence
That would
is.
be my first choice, but I would not find it inappropriate.
Okay.
And I agree with you exactly, Louise, and especially, I really dislike, I think that based on the evidence that I read and heard, I think that it's appropriate. But I also want to give a shout out to the Historic Commission, because I appreciate them being very strict, and I really always want them to err on the side of being strict. So I'm sorry to be that I'm probably not voting the way that the commission would prefer, but I just didn't see the evidence in the materials that would let me vote against it, which I do like. I liked the white fence also, and I do feel like the 3-rail fence, when I look at it, it doesn't look old, but when I read all the evidence about it, and when it is and the definition, and I thought it was a pretty compelling case that it's appropriate.
Jenny, do you want to put that in the form of a motion? I think everybody's had a chance to comment.
Okay, I will move to uphold.
Well, I guess the motion.
Maybe Alan ought to phrase it so we get it
Yeah,
exactly
I think
right.
the motion is to determine that the fence which was the fence that's there, which if it were just proposed, well, let me restate that the fence that is of the nature of what's there as the replacement fence meets the ordinance standards for a preservation plan approval.
So I move that.
Is there a second?
Second.
Mrs. Trotman? Do you want to call the roll, please?
Ms. Kermiller?
Yes.
Mr. Quinn?
Yes.
Mr. Texarney?
Yes.
Mrs. Trotman?
Yes.
Mrs. Ullman?
Yes.
Mrs. Gunning? Oh, sorry. Mr. Williamson?
Yes.
Ms. Wilson?
Yes.
Motion carried.
Do I hear a motion to
Move to adjourn.
Second.
Thank you.